So 54 Conservative MPs in the North have sent a letter to Boris Johnson warning him that their constituencies are going to be left behind if he doesn't come up with a clear strategy quickly for getting out of lockdown. The MPs have told the Prime Minister that his pledge to level up the nation, made those heady days after Labour's Red Wall was destroyed in last year's election, is now being brutally undermined by the swingeing lockdown rules and restrictions in their constituencies. Now, it's a big letter. It's signed by members of the Northern Research Group of Conservative MPs, and they're led by the former Minister, Jake Berry, and they include many of those who won traditionally Labour-held seats last year. They say that their constituents have just been the worst affected by COVID, with many of them losing jobs and losing businesses. They're also asking for their region to be made central to the country's economic recovery whenever that begins. The official response from Downing Street simply says, look, we stood at the last election on a solemn promise that we would improve people's lives, and although the pandemic has meant that 2020 is not the year that we all hoped it would be, OK, fair enough, our ambitions for this country remain unchanged. And the statement goes on to say that the commitment to levelling up Britain, that was the big one in the North, remains, quote, unchanged. Well, more than 7 million people in northern England are under Tier 3 restrictions at the moment, and the government's facing more and more pressure from these Tory MPs to ease the lockdown rules. Plus, of course, it was only earlier in the month that about 42 of them rebelled against that 10 p.m. curfew, that pointless 10 p.m. curfew for hospitality. So I guess the question this morning is, with this letter, with that earlier rebellion, is all of this starting to fall apart? Let's talk to the political commentator, Benedict Spence, see what he makes of all this. Good morning, Benedict.
Good morning, Richard. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, is that right? Are we seeing the beginning of, we talk about the collapse of the Red Wall, a collapse of Tory unity on lockdown?
I mean, I think that's sort of been fraying at the edges for some time. I think what we always have to do is take this with a sort of a pinch of salt. I mean, we've just come out of an incredibly sort of turbulent political time where the longevity of a government was actually sort of not entirely clear-cut. Theresa May, David Cameron sort of over Brexit. Boris Johnson does still have a very large, healthy majority, even with rebellious Tory MPs in the north of England. And he still has a good 4 years left of his premiership. So I don't think anybody needs to be massively panicking just yet. But the problem, of course, with all of this is there's no actual time limit on how long it's going to take in terms of getting out of the lockdown, in terms of putting in place an economic recovery strategy. So I can sit here and say, oh, well, he's still got 4 years to solve this. We could be sitting here in 2.5 years, and still not have found a way out, because there is a great deal of uncertainty. The government isn't being particularly forthcoming. You can understand why it doesn't want to come out and say, this is going to be our strategy for emerging from the lockdown, because what if there's a spanner in the works?
No.
What if it centers around a vaccine and a vaccine isn't developed on time? You can understand why they're being very cautious on this. But until that is sort of set in stone, until there is a clear roadmap out of the current situation, you are going to continue to get this sort of festering resentment amongst these MPs.
Well, that's a perfectly good and rational answer, but I think I need to focus my question perhaps a little bit more sharply then, because what I was really saying is, I totally take the point that Boris is secure until the next election. He's got a big majority, and these are just sort of, politically speaking, these are simply unpleasant headaches, maybe even migraines, but they're not serious in a political sense. What I really meant was, are the wheels coming off lockdown? And would that put Boris and his government in an impossible position if they're calling for sanctions and telling people to obey sanctions, which basically people aren't obeying? Their own MPs think that the sanctions are too rigorous and are not fair. We know that we're looking at bringing down quarantine from 2 weeks to 10 days or even 7 days, not because of any medical changes, but because people aren't obeying it. And we know more and more that the rule of 6 is being disobeyed. People are going to see each other in each other's houses. They are having Sunday lunch together. We know this. Word of mouth. It's out there on the street. So we're not getting the same kind of adherence to lockdown that we got back in March. And these MPs presumably are sitting on a cauldron up north, where a lot of people are not obeying the full Tier 3 restrictions. And once that starts to happen, you lose control. You lose political control. You lose legal control. And that was really my question. Do you think that's that's the way it's falling apart?
I mean, I do think that there's a lot of truth in that. A lot of people are sort of, looking at a lot of only the more nonsensical guidelines and are simply not observing them.
Yeah.
And I think that in many ways, actually, there's not too much of an issue with that, because I suppose if we're all sitting here saying, for example, that the 10 p.m. curfew, obviously that's one that's slightly more difficult to circumvent if you're a business because the police can see if you're open. But certainly if you're looking at a certain restriction and you say, it's nonsensical, so I'm not going to obey it, if you're right, it's not going to have any sort of major impact. And sort of people can sort of sotto voce get around these things without it being too much of an issue. The government, though, has to sort of remain quite steadfast on this. I don't think it can start to row back on these issues. And that's simply because, in my opinion at least, the government was very slow off the mark to do anything, be it lockdown or another strategy, be it herd immunity, at the start. That was the issue, was that the government was seen to be procrastinating. They weren't very decisive. On this time around, they can't go for a different strategy from the first strategy, because then people will say, well, what on earth was all about? That will lose a lot of confidence in the Prime Minister. So they have to be incredibly sort of firm on this, even if they know people are disobeying the rules, simply so that they can say, well, this time we learned from our mistakes and we did all that we could. And then individual people, a small number of people, took matters into their own hands. But fortunately, the rest of the British population, largely remained on side, stuck to the rules, and it was all fine. And I think a lot of this is down to the fact that they were absolutely terrified first time round about the projected worst case scenario,
Yes.
the number of deaths.
Well, that was Professor Ferguson's doing, wasn't it? He tipped them from a fairly equable and reasonably sensible approach to the virus. He tipped them into blind panic, didn't he, back in March?
Absolutely. But the thing with this, of course, is you have to remember the previous 10 years of Conservative rule have been sort of hounded by always there's this talk, and I'm not sure how much it cut through in the end when Boris Johnson was elected, but certainly it sort of, it was around David Cameron, it was around Theresa May, this Labour attack line of austerity having been responsible for the deaths of about 100,000 plus people. Now, we all know that that's not actually true, and it's also very difficult to quantify. But it's certainly something that, it was reeled out again and again. It was a very deliberate attack line. Deaths because of coronavirus are a lot easier to quantify and prove and pinpoint than deaths because of, austerity. Now, let's say that we had got, even halfway to the worst case scenario. Let's say we had 100,000 deaths because of coronavirus and the government had gone for the herd immunity. It would have been political devastation. They would not have been able to come back from that. So you can understand why an incredibly jumpy Prime Minister, having, not taken the bull by the horns at the start, then panicked, took a very hard line, and now cannot row back from that, but therefore probably will not clamp down too hard on individual people who are sort of flouting the rules, as long as it's not done in an overtly deliberate way.
But one of the apparent outcomes of the last election was that we thought we might actually see the first time in generations that the so-called North-South divide was going to be healed. The government was at pains to say, and Boris was at pains to thank former Labour voters in the North to coming over to the Tory side, to abandoning Labour, to putting their trust and their faith in the Conservative Party. And we are where we are today with 54 Conservative MPs writing to the PM saying this isn't fair, this is not fair on our constituents. So the divide's still there. And I do not speak as a metropolitan journalist. I started in London, but I've spent 20 years of my life working as a reporter and a presenter in the North. I went to Carlisle as a news reporter. I was in Leeds as a news reporter. I was in Manchester as a news reporter. I lived and had my children in Manchester. And speaking as a former Londoner, I was very conscious that this North-South divide, this thing in people's minds, is real. It's a real divide, and people in the North do have more than a trace of resentment to what they regard as the privileged and self-privileged and self-aggrandizing South. And this difference in the treatment of people during lockdown and this closure of so many parts of the northern way of life will be perceived. You can see it in Manchester and the way that Andy Burnham, the mayor, was talking last week. It will be seen as London yet again pulling the old trick, punishing the North for basically being the North. And I put it in that simplistic way because that's actually the way people do think. Not all of them, but it's there. And this is a real danger of exacerbating that problem, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can also see it in the way that a lot of Scottish voters have rallied around Nicola Sturgeon.
Very good point. Absolutely.
Simply being a little more, sort of stronger than the government in Westminster, and it's seen as sort of exceptionalism to Westminster and the South. I mean, I spent a lot of my time living in Liverpool, and I know that there's a great deal of sort of resentment towards London and the South, and people talk about Scouse exceptionalism up there, but you're right, it's not the best start, frankly, for a government that said that it was going to change the relationship. The only thing I think that you can say in the government's defence is, well, this all happened very quickly after it was elected, not really enough time to put in place any sort of meaningful strategy. Yeah. And the other thing you have to say is that the increase in cases has been happening in northern and Midland areas. It's not been happening in the south of England, in sort of Devon or Cornwall. And London is the exception. But of course, London has been calling for a lockdown. Sadiq Khan has been absolutely clear that he wants there to be a second lockdown and that it should be brought in faster. Now, I happen to think he's doing that for political reasons rather than practical reasons. But you can sort of see right there that resentment building. But again, I would have to say, long term, if there is a strategy, if the government had a strategy in place for actually levelling up, and we've heard all of this before with the Northern Powerhouse concept of George Osborne that amounted to nothing. Actually, what people will respond to is, after these lockdowns are a thing of the past, what then will the government do? Because this is the thing. There is still time just about to put in place a strategy to get out of this, to say, look, this was unfortunate, but this had to be done, for X, Y, Z reasons. But here is the proof in the pudding that we did commit to levelling up the North, and this is what we're going to do about it.
What is your sense at Westminster about the possibility, and it's clearly not going to happen this week, next week, or the week after, but there might be a complete revision and review of the way that we're dealing with the virus? Because what we're seeing now is an increasingly large section of the credible scientific community, and I'm talking about Nobel Prize winners, prominent amongst them, saying with clear cogency and logic that lockdown really doesn't work and is actually counterproductive. It doesn't work on its own terms, and it actually causes more problems that it doesn't solve. That it was initially it was an understandable reaction to what was happening back in March, but now we know so much more about the virus. We need to be attacking it in a much more intelligent and selective way. You've got the pressure coming from them. You've got similar pressure coming from virtually every newspaper in Britain. Most, I think, apart from the Guardian, most of them are arguing forcefully for abandoning lockdown as a tool to deal with the virus. You've got it coming from radio stations like this. I think the only place you don't get it coming from at the moment is the BBC, which seems to be basically parroting most of what the government says every day. But most of the mainstream media, with the BBC set aside, is arguing more and more forcefully for lockdown to be abandoned and replaced with a much more intelligent strategy. Do you get any sense at all that the government is preparing to do, if not a U-turn, a serious adjustment to the policy of lockdown?
I mean, I would be surprised if there was anything drastic. The only thing that I could see, that facilitating that would be a change of administration. And when I say that, I don't mean a Labour government, because Labour has been quite clear. Actually, it wants even stronger lockdown measures
yes.
in some cases. So it would have to be a new Conservative Prime Minister. And the thing with that is, as much as there's probably there is a lot of discontent with Boris Johnson, we have to remember actually why it was he became Prime Minister, having had that great sort of array of Tory MPs against him, the Never Boris campaign that facilitated Theresa May becoming Prime Minister. He was seen very much as, sort of grit your teeth and bear it. This is the man that we need to put in place to be the sacrificial lamb almost, to be the human battering ram, to get Brexit done. And to get, that's what's going to actually solve this impasse. And we don't mind, as it were, having this man, therefore, in place for a couple of years to be the person to soak up the political flack. Now, if you've already got, as it were, a human shield, a Prime Minister who fulfills that role in number 10, well, why would anybody want to step into the breach right now? And, what is an even worse political situation? Frankly, Boris Johnson, I don't think he's going to stand in the next general election, even if he wanted to. And I don't think he wants to. So actually, if you already know that vacancy is going to come up in a few years' time, why on earth would you sort of push for that change now if you're an ambitious Conservative? Because you can't win if you become Prime Minister right now, and then you are the one that has to sort of reverse everything whilst we're in the midst of the pandemic. I think you have to come to the end of that before you'll see a serious change made, and therefore I think the strategy will remain largely the same.
What makes you say that you think Boris doesn't want to stand again in 4 years, 3 years, 3 to 5 years time, depending on circumstances? Anyway, at the next election, what makes you say that? Is it because he's been winded by actually having COVID and nearly dying from it? Has that changed his worldview? Why would an ambitious politician, having won the prize, not want to keep it?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, the virus, having caught the virus, has certainly caused him sort of physical discomfort. It's clearly taken the wind out of his sails. The fact of the matter is he simply wasn't as hands-on and still isn't really as hands-on in the running of government or even appearing as the face of government since he's had it. But again, I think the reality of the situation is Boris Johnson would have been a very good Prime Minister had he inherited David Cameron's victory in 2010. That he's not really somebody, in a different era, I think he could have been remembered as a very good Prime Minister. But I think he probably looks at this situation right now and suspects those good times are not really on the horizon anytime soon. In order to sort of rehabilitate his own political record, I'm sure he could do it. But there is that question, he's got a young family, he's got a very large family. And it's that sort of question, is there still the fight? Is there still the desire? As you say, he's an incredibly ambitious politician, but he's already achieved the highest office in the land. There's nowhere really further that he can go, even by staying prime minister. And his popularity isn't going to improve. He got a majority of 80 at the last general election. I don't think anybody, even if he were to sort of lead us out of the pandemic and come up with a good sort of economic recovery plan, he's not going to improve on that. No. It's only going to get narrower. So you have to ask, really, given his age, given everything that he's sort of been through, and given actually the limited amount of time that he can, as it were, go out into the rest of the world and make real money, which is the only thing really that he can do, you have to ask yourself, is there still that drive? And I don't think it's still there.
That's very interesting, because, of course, he's no Churchill then. I mean, Churchill during the war, and when the war was going very badly for the British, and it looked like we might even lose it midway through the war, Churchill's ratings were on the floor. I mean, people forget this now, but he went through some desperately unpopular times, but he fought on and on and on and on, and until, quote, the sunlit uplands arrived. Interesting to hear you say that Boris is unlike his hero in that regard. Listen, just one more quick question about Boris off this. And I was predicting, along with many commentators yesterday, that by tea time last night, Boris would have done a U-turn on these school meal vouchers for school kids, and he hasn't. And he's talking tough. Just very briefly, why is he making such a big stand on something which is losing him a lot of popularity?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine on this. I mean, the thing is, I understand entirely the sort of the ideological perspective. We don't want there to be endless amounts of money being just thrown into the state system. We don't want it to be that people become entirely beholden on the state, especially to feed themselves or their children. That's not actually the direction a Conservative government wants to go to. You can understand also that the Labour Party would play absolute havoc if it was introduced and then got rid of. People saying, oh, Boris Johnson is starving your children, he's taking away your free food that we, the Labour Party, have fought for. So you can understand why he doesn't want that. And then you look at everything else that the Conservative Party has spent money on, at how else it has made people beholden on the state. And you think, and this is a very odd line to draw, starving children. That's a strange one.
It is.
So your guess is as good as mine.
OK, and I think you probably speak for the nation there, and possibly even his closest advisors. Benedict, thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed talking to you. It's